Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this 16 days event. Still have a few more people joining, and then we'll get started. So first of all, just some housekeeping. We're recording this event and we'll publish on the website later, so you can rewatch it if you missed some bits. And also there is a Q&A box where you can ask your questions, and then we'll get to them after the presentations. Today we are joined by Professor Jenny Parks. We have Sujata Bordoloi and Lucia Quintero, who will tell us about their research on gender-based violence in schools, which I'm very, very excited to hear about. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Jenny Parks.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Can I just check that you can see that? Okay.
It's perfect.
Great. Lovely to see people arriving. I'm very happy to be here today on this kind of important 16 days of activism around gender-based violence. That this is, as you know, a global campaign, happens every year from the 25th of November. So there's lots of events going on at the moment. So I'm great that you're able to join us for this one. We decided to call it Research to Action, or Research Action on School-Related Gender-Based Violence, because what we really want to talk about is this relationship between research and action. And action in this case, we're thinking really around policy or programs or different kinds of actions to address school-related gender-based violence. And when we were thinking about that, we were thinking about it in terms of thinking about different kinds of ways in which research evidence influences actions to address violence, and also the kind of research evidence that exists about interventions around school-related gender-based violence. So we're really thinking at that kind of interface of research, policy, practice. And with that on board, when LIDC invited me, I'm sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm a professor in education, gender and international development at the UCL Institute of Education. And I have been involved in a number of projects that I'm going to be referring to during the course of the next hour around violence in schools and gender, and how that different kinds of projects that have been done at this sort of interface between research, policy and practice. And some of those projects have been with Sujata, who was very delighted able to join me, who is the coordinator of the Global Working Group on School-Related Gender-Based Violence, Srgb, and works for UNGEI, the UN Girls Education Initiative, and so has been very explicitly bringing together advocacy, different forms of activism and research, and trying to get them to speak to each other. So I was really delighted that Sujata said she'd come and join me. And then Lucia's got a number of kind of relevant hats here. So Lucia has a kind of background also working at this kind of interface of research and particularly around programs around violence in schools and gender-based violence. Is also doing her PhD on this topic and has been contributed to one of our recent research initiatives where we've been reviewing literature, which we're going to be focusing on today. So Lucia is going to be presented on the work that we've been doing jointly together to look at different kinds of evidence on this topic. So that's how we come together to be a triple act this morning. And the way we wanted to do it was we wanted to speak for maybe about 40 minutes roughly. And we're just going to jump around a bit between us. So we've got one presentation, but we're kind of jumping between us in terms of presenting it. And then hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end for a broader discussion and Q&A session. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Sujata to start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jenny, for those kind words. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and I've learned a lot from you and sort of your framing of this issue in terms of gender, how gender violence and education kind of intersect. So I was asked to present today a kind of framing for school-related gender-based violence, the definition, and how the kind of global framing of this, if you will, came about. The definition that you see on the screen, and I'm just gonna read it out. School-related gender-based violence is any act or threat of sexual, physical, or psychological violence occurring in and around schools, perpetrated as a result of gender norms and stereotypes and enforced by unequal power dynamics. So this definition, came from the acceptance of violence against children in and around schools. So the sexual, physical, and psychological violence, which already kind of existed as a definition for violence against children, or the kinds of areas of violence. But the use of the gender norms and stereotypes and power dynamics was quite an intentional focus, and it was really to highlight the gender dimensions of school violence and spotlight the extent to which it was a barrier to girls' education and gender equality in education. So this was put forward by a number of international NGOs, donors, UNESCO, UNGEI, UN Women, and others who came together on the margins of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, so prior to that. And the idea really was to advocate that an attention to Srgb be part of the Goal 4 and the Education 2030 framework for action. And actually, they succeeded. I mean, UNGEI with its partners, for the first time, there was an explicit commitment to end gender-based discrimination and violence in education, and was framed, or there was a specific framing of it within the Incheon Declaration. And then later in 2015, the definition was also adopted in a UNESCO resolution by 52 member states. So this framing kind of recognizes the intersecting forms of violence, and it sought to capture the interlinkages between the different forms of violence, as well as how acts of violence overlap in and around the school environment. So, it emphasized that responses needed to be much more holistic and much more addressing the root causes and drivers of violence, and gender being kind of an intersecting factor of marginalization. So it focused, this focus served well in kind of advocacy. So the work that I've been doing with the Global Working Group, which I'll speak to later on, it really helped to amplify and bring to light, how gender intersects with other factors of marginalization and violence in and around the education space. And it also alerted the education sector that this was something that was occurring in and around schools, and that education needed to pay much more attention in its education programs to address gender-based violence. So in terms of programming advocacy, it's been a very sort of holistic definition. But when it comes to sort of measurement and especially around, how do you separate acts of violence and the consequences as well as programs, it's been a bit of a challenge. And especially around, so we've been doing some work around trying to come up with prevalence figures, again, for advocacy purposes. And it's shown us that it's really hard to collect data on school-related gender-based violence specifically, where you can actually make the linkages with gender norms, power structures, power dynamics, and establish how acts of violence are perpetrated as a result of gender norms. So, the very hardcore quantitative measurement experts have, found it really challenging to do that. And then also current school and household-based surveys don't collect data on violence, and they don't on all forms of violence. Neither do they collect information on sort of attitudes, behaviors, gender norms, etc. The other challenge has been that interlinkages between the different forms of violence gets in the way of sort of rigorous measurement of interventions that reduce incidence of violence and shift gender norms. So this has led to two things. One is that programs will often be very narrowly focused on trying to measure gender norms and then not looking at how it reduces violence. And the other piece is that the complexity of integrating gender in violence prevention activities deters policymakers and education actors from kind of fully investing in prevention programs through the education system. So we've got several great research and evidence-based initiatives, but they are either they don't meet the rigor, or they are not, because they're pilot programs, they're not fully adaptable, or education systems will say, these are the civil society is the best space where they can address this issue, so they won't take it on board. And the other challenge with a broader kind of intersectional framing is that you always have the danger of gender being mainstreamed without actually addressing the root causes and drivers of violence. So I'll stop here, and I know that Jenny and Lucia are both going to be speaking about some of these issues in more detail. So over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Sujata. That's really helpful to get that kind of definition and also to raise some of the issues. I think it kind of overlapped a bit with what I was going to say next, which was the quest that we have been getting from Sujata, but also from other organisations, is to answer this question around what works. And there's a quest for kind of evidence-based solutions to help guide action on Srgb. International organisations clearly, wanting to for the reasons that Sujata was just talking about, to understand what works. And we hear that quite often in different areas. The FCDO have been doing a whole range of projects around what works on violence against women and girls. Same questions around in the kind of more the field around violence against children. And so there's a lot of pressure coming, or not pressure in a way, but an invitation or a challenge coming from international organisations. But the whole kind of question of what works also is problematic in some ways. And I just want to draw attention to 4 or 5 of those ways in which I find it difficult and problematic. I mean, firstly, there are the huge ethical and methodological challenges around researching children's experiences with violence. We know that violence, and particularly some forms of violence, including sexual violence, are underreported, that it's very difficult to get accurate data, that it's surrounded by stigma, taboos, often fear of speaking about experiences. The whole language, often we use different terms and language, so we're not always asking about the same thing. And there's a risk of harm in doing the research in the first place, potentially causing distress, occasionally potentially increasing risks to safety. And that's something that people have been writing about in relation to collecting data during COVID and some of the ethical challenges around remote data collection. So it's a very difficult and sensitive area to be conducting research in. The asking around what works, often I think particular kinds of evidence get privileged. It gets skewed towards trials or evaluations, often of short-term interventions that are kind of measurable, something that you can measure at a particular moment of practice. So, at the end of a short-term intervention, often quite narrowly framed and with little long-term follow-up. So there's a kind of bias towards measurable quantitative kind of methods, and much sometimes also kind of self-reports as well. So you know, measures of changes in attitudes or perspectives, less often of behaviours and practices. Another related problem is this kind of quest for global solutions, and this kind of also the kind of narrow interventions which really measured often neglects the multidimensionality of violence that we were just hearing about from Sujata, how one form of violence seeps into another, how the violent acts are really just a kind of scraping at the surface of the kind of relationships, the institutional and structural dimensions that surround acts of violence, and those can get missed if the focus is too narrow, and in turn these kind of emphasis on measurable outcomes and the methods that become attached to that often kind of miss the complex relationships, the kind of systems and the institutional drivers that kind of influence change. So rather than ask what works, should we be asking, you know, why does something work, or how does it work or not, in what context? And then my next point is that they tend to, you know, asking what works suggests that the same thing's going to work from one place to another, and this often disconnects from context. Is it really asking the question of what matters? I'm stealing that expression from some of Elaine and Tahalta's work, where she asks what works or what matters. There's kind of assumption that an intervention that's tried and tested in one location can just be lifted and moved into another. And often that's from the global north into the global south. And an example that I was a bit shocked to find out was that none of the 67 trials using the World Health Organization Health Promoting School Framework were violence interventions in LM, in lower middle income contexts. So even though these are kind of considered to be, you know, good practice, they're not coming from evidence that's coming from the global south. So the findings become of very limited value in settings where education systems, school conditions and processes, norms about gender or childhood, and patterns of violence may be very different. And can also be a kind of lack of consideration of what matters among young people in their diverse communities. So I'm not wanting to say that this research shouldn't be happening, but what I want it to say that we should be broadening the kinds of research that we value and that we think about, and also that we are challenged to undertake. Are we actually doing the right kind of research to be able to answer these more complex and difficult multi-layered questions? So those are kind of the implications, I guess, for research. We need to bring into view in research that asks not just what works, but also what matters, why, how do some policies or practices work or not, for whom, with what conditions, and what are the kinds of transversal dialogues across research, policy, practice, and among, you know, with young people that we need to engage in. With that in mind, we are sort of trying to think today about what works, but we're trying to ask some of these other questions as well. And we have done a number of projects with organisations like UNICEF, like the UK FCDO, where we've been thinking about the relationship between evidence and practice. And we're drawing particularly today on a review that we started in 2016, which is this one you can't see very well at the bottom of the screen, bottom left of the screen, which is our rigorous review of research evidence on policy and practice on Srgb that we did as part of our work with UNICEF. And then we've updated it most recently this year in work with towards the FCDO's Red Note on addressing school-related gender-based violence, which unfortunately is not publicly available yet because we're going through the last rounds of permission to be able to publish it on our own website. But Lucia and I have been doing a lot of work on that very recently, so we're going to give you some of that fresh off the press thinking that we've been doing. And just to give a little bit of background, in the original, the 2016 review, we found initially, our initial screening came up with something like 2,500 publications, which we then reduced to 171. And then we reviewed those, but in detail, there were about 49 studies that met all our kind of criteria for rigor and relevance. And then since then, we've updated those 49 studies so that our most recent review, we look quite closely at 79 studies, which is quite a bit more than a lot of the systematic reviews that you read on in this kind of field of work. And on the blue text there is the our kind of review criteria and standards for rigor summed up briefly. We wanted to focus on our research that was on interventions that engaged with a policy or practice on addressing Srgb in some sort of substantive way. So a large number of studies that are on school-related gender-based violence, but are more around the context of violence or the background, but didn't deal so much with a policy or practice intervention. They were kind of excluded from the review. We had various criteria. Some of it is very familiar to those of you who are familiar with reviews. We looked at the conceptual framing, the transparency and openness of the approach, the robustness of the methodology, whether there was attention to ethics, and more traditional standards of validity and reliability, and also the kind of persuasiveness and coherence of the analysis. So a range of kind of criteria. We also looked at the kind of gendered analysis. So we excluded work on violence against children that didn't mention gender at all, but the gendered analysis that we included didn't necessarily have to be all that sophisticated. It could be, you know, just a kind of disaggregated data or some reflection on gender, whereas other papers were very much more theorized around gender. So we kind of, as long as it had a clear gender component, we included those papers. And then importantly, we looked at the kind of contextual relevance and engagement. And so we excluded from nearly all the papers were research that's being conducted in lower or middle income contexts. And we also looked at, you know, whether there was any evidence of kind of how the engagement with community contexts or contexts in some way. So there are a range of criteria, some of them more traditional, some of them a little bit different that aren't necessarily included, that then brought us to our kind of 79 studies. And Lucia is going to say a little bit more about the kind of patterning in those 79 studies.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, we thought about, before delving into what we learned about what matters in successfully intervening in Srgb, we thought it would be interesting to talk briefly about the distribution of those 79 studies and to draw attention to 3 distinct patterns. The first trend shows that there was an increment in the volume of work published. The studies included in our reviews were published within a 16-year period. And by dividing this time period, we observed that the average number of studies published per year doubled from 3.25 publications per year in 2006 to 2013 to an average of 6.62 in the years 2014 to 2021. So if we take publications as a proxy, we can see a growing interest, a momentum on this topic. So there's more and more interventions on Srgbv that are being evaluated in low and middle income countries, and we have more access to information. However, the attention on Srgbv interventions is not homogeneous. The second pattern of these studies is regarding the context in which they were conducted. We found a clear dominance for studies situated in the African context. 65% of the studies we included in our reviews were located in Africa. 16% were from Asia, and 8 studies came from Latin America and the Caribbean. And this trend strengthens over time. If we compare the 2 time points in which we added the studies, the original 2015 review, the African continent represented 55% of the sample, and in the 2021 update, they represented 74%. And we also found South Africa was a country with most studies, with 17, and that followed by Uganda with 9 studies and Kenya with 7. So it also seems that studies are concentrated in African countries that also speak English. This perhaps is a bias of how we search for articles, but there is a clear dominance for studies in African continent. Thirdly, regarding methodologies, Jenny already mentioned it a little bit, but we found that over half, just under half of the studies we included adopted a quantitative research method. Many were RCTs or other type of experimental evaluations. So again, there is a strong tendency to look into what works and sometimes not how and what matters. And this trend of quantitative dominance remained relatively constant through the original and the update of the studies. However, a quarter of the studies used mixed methods approach, where a quantitative evaluation of project was explained through qualitative work, and there was a lot of richness in the data. There was also around 1/5 of studies that use qualitative methods, including some participatory approaches with young people or action research with teachers. So despite the quantitative dominance, it is important to note that because the way we've been reviewing these studies, we got a lot about what matters for interventions to be successful through the qualitative and the mixed methods studies. They provided a lot of richness that was very important for our analysis. And in the next slides, we will start discussing the evidence from promising interventions, dividing them up through different topics. And I think, Jenny, if you want to jump in to the first set of evidence.
Thanks, Lucia. Yeah, quite a large number of the studies look at interventions directly with children, often through clubs or groups or in some form, sometimes out of school, often kind of after school. And that body of evidence is quite strong in terms of showing how some of the work that's done directly with children has led to improved gender equitable attitudes and in quite a diverse range of interventions, and also reduced violence through participatory learning approaches involving critical reflection, communication, conflict resolution. Some of those are some of the kind of themes that seem to be important in terms of this kind of quite diverse range of kind of interventions. What some of the studies also show is that those need to be tailored for the local context. So one of the example of that comes from ActionAid's Stop Violence Against Girls in Schools project, which was a 5-year intervention. We were involved in the research linked to that. And when it came to the endline study, one of the things we found was that the girls' clubs that had operated in the 3 countries, they were all effective in some ways, in that there did seem to be some sort of shift in attitudes towards gender and violence. But only in Mozambique did there also seem to be an increase in terms of increase in reporting, girls reporting about any violence they experienced. And we think that that was because of the setting where the project was taking place in Mozambique was a kind of bit more of a peri-urban setting compared with the more rural settings in Ghana and Kenya, where the intervention was operating. So there were kind of networks and support systems around, and quite a lot of kind of messaging that seemed to perhaps influence what was happening in the girls' clubs actually translating into action. So I think in that sense, the girls' clubs seem to be more effective in the particular kind of context. That relationship between the intervention and the context is very important. A number of the studies have also found that they require skilled facilitation. You can't just kind of have a club and expect anyone to be able to run it. That the kind of support for the facilitators and the skills of facilitators are very important. And they also need to be, they're much more effective if they run over an extended period of time. So another example there comes from the Right to Play project in Pakistan, which extended over 2 years, and there was a lot of kind of play-based life skills work that had an effect on reducing peer violence. They've also found that they're more effective when they're integrated into school cultures. And then, so that takes me to the kind of whole school approaches. So many studies conclude that whole school approaches are needed, but there are relatively few studies that actually look at what that actually means in practice, or what are the kind of important components of whole school approaches. But there are some very good studies, and they are kind of multi-layered. The kind of characteristics that seem to be important is actually working at the level of changing school policies and practices and processes within school, having the commitment and support of school leaders, and also some training and support for dedicated teachers, having kind of enthusiastic, dedicated teachers who will drive the change in the school with the support of the school management. And then also actively engaging pupil participation and involvement of parents, carers, and other community members. So involving and engaging the broader school community. A number of studies have looked at how that can help to reduce teacher violence and peer violence and sexual violence. And all of those were features, for example, of the Good School Toolkit in Uganda, which was has been a very effective and increasingly widely used whole school approach, particularly focused around corporal punishment. But many more studies are needed from LMICs, and also on how they can be sustained. There's few of them that have looked over an extended period of time about whether any changes in school become embedded in the practices of schools, and then how do you also scale them up so that often they're led again by NGOs. In the case of the Good Schools Toolkit, the staff are incredibly talented and provide a kind of ongoing contact for the the protagonist teachers in schools to kind of keep the momentum going. So what happens when you haven't got that NGO support, when the funding runs out? How do you integrate that into the school system? So there's a number of questions there with these approaches we still need to know more about. I'm going to hand back to Lucia.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, the second set of evidence, we organized it around work on teachers and curriculum. And this includes studies on teacher training, both pre-service and in-service training, which sought to enhance teachers' abilities to adopt gender-inclusive pedagogies and nonviolent classroom management techniques, and also studies that developed and used curriculum to support Srgb prevention in schools, such as comprehensive sexual education or conflict resolution curricula. We found around 20 studies that touched on these subjects. And what we learned, what these studies tell us that matter, is that when intervening on teacher trainings, it is important to do two things at least. First, most of these trainings that were successful, they provided a safe space and sufficient time for teachers to critically reflect on the structural and cultural norms that underpin Srgb. They gave them time to discuss with colleagues, and there was proper guidance to engage with these norms. Without this, teachers are not likely to shift in their own beliefs or practices. And sometimes if this does not happen, training and curriculum can actually be used to reinforce gender stereotypes. So that was one part of successful trainings and approaches with teachers. A second one was that trainings were an opportunity to demonstrate how to teach differently. So the way they were delivered really mattered. So when interventions utilized pedagogies that demonstrated how to change power dynamics of authority in teaching, with, for example, participatory methods and inclusive and interactive pedagogies, then that gave teachers an opportunity to tangibly engage with cultural norms that sustained Srgb practices. And what the studies show is, again, that this requires, as in with the work with children, time, proper contextualization, and very skillful guidance and facilitation. One very good example of a project that dealt with these issues is a qualitative study called Inviting Backchat, and it's on a 3-year action research project with students and teachers from 16 primary schools in 6 different sub-Saharan countries. And the project placed children's voices and perspectives at the center of developing a curriculum. And this was created through curriculum development groups where students were in dialogue with teachers. And what the project hypothesized was that over time, this process of dialogue between these two parties would create mutual understanding and viewpoints and shift teaching towards constructively teaching on sexual education that was based on students' experiences and dilemmas. A facilitator or researcher was the one that helped facilitate this dialogue. And in the process, teachers were really able to debate among themselves about preconceived notions regarding cultural norms and structures. And by engaging with students' opinions, they started to view their students differently. And this shifted the way sexual education was delivered from something that was very mechanistic and fact-focused to a more relational approach. And these shifts also happened in other types of teaching where a relationship was developed that was much more close and equal amongst teachers and students. And the richness of this study is not that it gives, a set solution of how to implement, but it grapples with the limitations, the difficulties when intervening to prevent Srgb. And it shows that it matters greatly if teachers feel heard, feel supported, feel trusted before they can confidently challenge cultural norms or change their own practices. So how teachers felt was very important. This idea is reinforced by another study that found that without properly engaging teachers, curriculum delivery and perhaps curriculum that was very pertinent could be obstructed, either because teachers don't feel confident in what they're being asked to teach, or they might disagree with it. This project, called The World Starts With Me, was a computer-based sexual education curriculum, and it was facilitated by teachers. It was targeted to 12 to 19-year-olds, and it was getting the students to make responsible choices concerning their sexuality and relationships. And it was originally designed for Ugandan schools, but it was later adapted to 10 other countries. 3 RCTs were conducted, and they found some positive effects, but the effects were really very modest. And this study looks into, what happened. And what they found was that teachers either shortened or selectively skipped lessons due to lack of time, or because they disagreed with certain lessons. They also found that teachers were not able to facilitate the curriculum as was intended. It was intended to be delivered by utilizing gender transformative pedagogy. So what they found was that teacher training and support had been insufficient, and that the curriculum lost its transformative power if teachers were not engaged properly, even in the curriculum development process. So we found a lot of that evidence, like with children, that it takes time, that you need to help and facilitate, debates about norms that underpin certain gender discriminatory practices. And again, we also found evidence, most of the evidence related to small NGO-led interventions, which and few from teacher training institutions or from large-scale rollouts. So that limits our knowledge about how to take positive interventions to scale. I think in the next slide, we also looked at what was happening outside of schools, around schools. And for example, we looked about studies that informed us about child protection services. And what we found was that most of these formal child protection services in low and middle income countries, they tended to be weak and under-resourced. Sometimes there was a lack of follow-up when cases were reported, or sometimes stigmatization of children, and there was uneven provision. One of the studies that was very interesting is a study in 2 South African provinces. And what they found was that whilst around 98% of children knew of where to get help, only 20% of children that had suffered some kind of abuse ever talked about it. So it was not about not knowing where to go, but there were barriers that did not allow them to seek support. And that same study also found that most of the cases that were followed up through community action rather than through the formal channels. So these studies indicate that there is potential to improve responses to Srgbv by strengthening the links between formal and informal child protection services. One such initiative that started to do this was the Safe Schools for Teens in the Philippines. And this intervention was part of a curriculum intervention that taught students about safe dating, consent, recognizing abusive relationships. But it also trained teachers about how they should react when a child discloses abuse. What research also shows us is that children normally will disclose abuse to a caregiver or a teacher rather than a child protection professional. So this intervention helped teachers understand what the process was. what they were expected to do, how to recognize certain types of abusive relationships, and guide them and make them understand when I make a referral, what is going to happen. And the study found that after the training and the strengthening of the child protection channels in schools, there was an increment in referrals of child disclosures of abuse, whilst before teachers did not refer. So there is potential for building between the formal and the formal child protection structures, about creating a space for communities to dialogue about these services and appropriate, make them adapted to the context. We also looked at studies that try to find, make the journey to school safer, or for example, children that have to live away from home to attend secondary schools. And we really found very little information on this topic. So a lot more is needed. And the interventions that we did find, they talked about, for example, giving bicycles to girls so that their journey to school could be safer, or organizing some kind of accompanying children to school. So it was a lot about, solutions to violence problems, but not attacking the root causes on why violence occurs on the way to school and why children are vulnerable. So there was a lot of information, but still more research, I think, would be needed, particularly around the safety of young people living away from home. They normally are in the nexus between poverty and lack of supervision. So a lot of research is needed on those areas. Jenny, can I pass it over to you?
Sure, yeah. I mean, on that last point as well, it's not just to do with intervening at that level of the community, but also about how secondary school provision is organised so that young people don't have to live away from home in situations that are vulnerable. And it's that which takes me to the next slide, which is really thinking about how these local level interventions that we've been talking at the level of the school or outside the school or the community map onto what's happening in the education sector at district and national levels. And there's relatively small amount of research that looks at that. What it tends to find is that multi-level systemic prioritization of child protection and gender equality is needed throughout the education sector, and that there have been significant efforts to strengthen legislative and policy frameworks around the world to prevent violence at national levels. But the studies that have looked at the kind of implementation or what happens to those laws and policies have raised questions about the kind of processes of policy enactment, the way laws are enacted by actors and institutions, organisations at the kind of national, mid and local levels. Quite often there's an expectation that a kind of transmission model is used, cascade policy, the idea that you can raise awareness, you just tell people and things are going to change, rather than kind of set up structures throughout the education sector that really think about how to feed into policy and also make policy a kind of living, kind of do its work. They tend to miss these kind of interlinked conceptual, political and resource barriers that hinder the work of key actors to mainstream work on gender and violence through the education sector. And this came across again and again in the work that we did with UNICEF, the End Gender Violence in Schools initiative, which was a 3-year initiative between 2014 and 2017 or 18. that UNICEF led working with Ethiopia, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Togo Ministries of Education and other stakeholders. And as part of that work, we carried out scoping studies in each of the countries to look at what work was going on to address what were the policy and practices already in place. And we had a number of workshops with stakeholders to discuss the evidence and the practices that were going on. And then the government's, the Ministries of Education led on developing action plans on the basis of the findings. And then further work was done according to those action plans to try and support that work. So it's a kind of action research initiative that UNICEF were leading on to try and strengthen evidence and also strengthen the use of evidence around Srgb. What we found in the scoping studies was that the people working at different levels of the education system, there was a lot of kind of commitment amongst particular people, but they were often found it very difficult to kind of put into action the work that they wanted to be doing. And so they found, particularly the kind of mid-level, the kind of what we call the missing middle, that that staff were often very unsupported. So we found that at national level officials, there were sometimes people like units, gender units, for example, in Ethiopia, who faced competing pressures and resistance from colleagues to doing gender work. And the problems that they had were sometimes amplified when you got to the kind of mid-level or the local level, where somebody would be given the gender job on top of everything else in their day-to-day work, with very few resources, and also, you know, very little status. Other kind of jobs in the offices were considered to be more kind of important or significant than gender work. So sometimes they felt quite unsupported. So in some ways, it amazed me how much commitment and will there was amongst people who just had so many pressures, and yet they were working in a situation where they were dealing with really difficult kind of politicized issues and facing a lot of resistance. So there seems to be very little recognition of the kind of sensitivity of their work, or the contestation, or the kinds of complex dialogues that they needed to engage in to be able to move forward with the work. So I think there's a lot more attention needed, both in research sense and in terms of policy and practice, to enhance the role of the district and provincial education officers in supporting teachers on the ground. As Lucia was saying, there's quite a small amount of research on teacher training institutions and their role, both in kind of pre-service, but also in-service support for teachers, and also the role of teacher unions, the area that seems to be very under thought about in terms of this area. There are a few interesting teacher networks, and there are also cross-sectoral groups, but both of those could be developed further in supporting and strengthening capacities of schools to address violence. So within the education sector, there's a lot of work to be done. There's also not very much literature, but some literature that has found how integrated health, education, justice, and gender sensitive interventions sort of cross sectors can be quite effective, and kind of working across that level of government and non-governmental donors and civil society. And I've given two examples there, and the reference lists for all these are at the end of the slides, so we'll make those available if you want to follow them up. But the Matthews example comes from South Africa, and it's a kind of small scale study around how cross-sectoral work managed to reduce adolescent IPV, whereas the Ellsberg study that I'm referencing here is a kind of over many years, I think about 20 years in Nicaragua, where they have looked at kind of how the young people are much more likely to speak about violence now, and there's been reductions, quite large reductions in adolescent IPV, which they attribute, you know, I think more work needs to be done within that study itself, but they're attributing that to this kind of range of actions by this collective cross-sectoral work that's created change at that kind of level of society over a 20-year period. It's quite interesting study to see something that's at a kind of societal level. What we also found in our work, and I think Sujata's already kind of alluded to this, is that it's difficult to get data at school level. There need to be clearer and stronger school level reporting systems, upheld by adequate training and support for school and district level actors, partly to kind of increase accountability and action at school level, but also to feed up to policy planners so that you know, it's not always kind of top-down way that policy is working, but actually data is coming from schools, from districts, that actually then feeds into changes in policy to create more responsive policy. Okay, so just to, I'm going to conclude on research, and then I'm going to hand back to Sujata to think through some of the implications for practice and some of the work that she's been involved with that addresses some of the issues that we've been raising. In terms of research, what we've seen, as Lucia said earlier on, is that over the past few years there has been a growth in good quality research on Srgb, which is encouraging. And what the overall body of literature is saying is that investment in violence prevention is in and around schools, in low and middle income contexts, can bring about positive change. So it's worth investing in. But we need more research to consolidate and shift, and more action to consolidate and shift in norms and practices and processes really for around gender and violence. We need more research on multi-component interventions to really understand how they work together in what context and for whom, and on systems change. How to institutionalize and sustain violence prevention in school systems, how to engage local and national actors and organizations, how in cost-effective ways to integrate interventions to help to strengthen existing systems. These are all questions that kind of come across again and again in our research. It's good to see that there's a range of research methods that are being used. I think there's a lot of scope for developing some forms for more participatory research, more mixed methods research and longitudinal research supported by theoretical perspectives that really engage with the kind of complex nature of change in relation to violence prevention. There are also still a number of gaps. More research is needed on interventions to prevent young people in LMICs facing multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, including disability, sexual orientation and gender identities. And more research is needed on violence prevention interventions in conflict-affected settings. And then just a kind of word of caution, highlighting Srgbv has a risk of deficit stereotyping of girls in the global south as victims to be saved or rescued through solutions from far away. And we can recognize that attention to vulnerabilities can be a kind of pragmatic way to steer resources towards genuine need, but we also need to turn the gaze. Turning the gaze requires research with young people as collaborators, and we need also to be interrogating the global and international, as well as the national and local structures and forces that exacerbate inequalities and injustices that underpin violence. And I'm just going to turn now to Sujata to end our presentation with some reflections from policy and practice.
Thank you, Jenny. So just kind of bringing it all into some reflections. This slide is really to highlight the need for multi-agency, cross-sectoral sort of collaboration on this. So the Global Working Group to End School-Related Gender-Based Violence was established in 2014, and one of its mandates, so we had three. One was on advocacy to really highlight the issue of Srgb as an education issue, a human rights issue, and an issue that needed urgent attention in order for us to meet the SDG targets around girls' education and education for all. The second piece was around research and evidence, and really ensuring that there was more coherence across agencies who were doing bits and pieces of work on this area. And also to, as Jenny pointed out, to kind of shift the focus of global North-led research situated in the global North to more of research and understanding of these issues situated in the global South and led by researchers and academics who are living in those contexts. So because the nature of the group was a global one, we had obviously organizations that represented global global mandates. But we did a lot of work to facilitate conversations and learning exchanges at the regional and national level. Next slide, please. So the coalition really worked around 4 areas, policy advocacy, normative guidance, standards and tools, ensuring multi-sectoral interagency collaboration and knowledge exchange and learning. So around policy advocacy, I'd mentioned before about the SDG targets, and then there was a lot of closer advocacy, I want to say, because the working group was made up of donors, academics, and practitioners. We were in a good position to put out, messaging, research, evidence, and data, which could influence all of its members to integrate an attention to Srgb within their own programming, whether it be education programming or particularly program space focused on girls' education. Around the normative guidance, standards and tools, the evidence synthesis that Jenny and their team did, and some of the work that Elaine and others did, really influenced, and also we took evidence from the violence against women and girls area of work and violence against children, really helped to kind of put out certain normative standards about what integrating Srgb within the education sector might look like. And of course, these are guidance for partners and development actors at the global level. But we were also able to synthesize or bring voices from the field in terms of member organizations who were doing programs on the ground. Not necessarily, so the focus was not so much about how rigorously evaluated these initiatives were, but how they showed promise in terms of making starting those conversations within the education system. So the thematic briefs and the COVID-19 policy recommendations really brought together those kind of voices. I also wanted to just highlight that the minimum standards, the impetus for the minimum standards really came from Jenny's work, what she mentioned about whole school approaches being showing the most promise, but at the same time we didn't have enough evidence on what a whole school approach through the education system might look like. We had only the Good Schools Toolkit, which was actually implemented by an NGO, and the integration of it within the system came much later. They first piloted the approach. So the minimum standards were really guided, development of them were really guided by some of this research. And that kind of brings me to the point of how this coalition served to bridge that gap between research and practice. So really taking research and making sure that we put out the findings from this research in a way that practitioners can easily absorb them and include them in their own programming. Around the knowledge and exchange and learning, that has been a critical role of the Global Working Group in terms of bringing different types of evidence on the table through these learning exchanges and conversations rooted in context. So we had regional ones in West and Central Africa and Eastern Southern Africa, and one in Latin America this year as well. And these were really led by the actors in the region, and we brought together the cluster of countries that form in those regions, and they enabled sort of conversations between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners regionally and nationally, and led to kind of national and regional partnerships around advocacy, research, and practice. Bringing in feminist networks and youth voices has been a really important part of the work, and there is much more work to be done around this. We've just started to do it in terms of really highlighting young people's role in creating safe spaces for themselves, as as in peer-to-peer networks or in groups where they are able to share their experience of violence and voice it and take it to relevant authorities or relevant power holders in their communities. We're just starting to do some of this work, but there's a lot more that needs to be done around this area. Bringing in that cross-sectoral lens at the global level was a great conversation starter at regional and national levels in terms of alerting the Ministry of Education really to recognize that they need to be talking with education unions, they need to be talking with other departments, the Ministry of Social Welfare or Ministry of Gender in certain contexts. Again, a lot more work needs to be done around that, but having this kind of a cross-sectoral group at the national level, at the global level, which held these conversations at the regional level, did really spark those conversations. And we have now another global initiative that's seeking to do similar things. It also kind of influenced the donor community to break down silos. In terms of looking at this issue not as a protection issue, which often when we talk about violence against children, it would be looked at in the education sector as a protection issue, which needs to be dealt by child protection colleagues. And I think that silo was really broken through this work, where we started to see more investments by donors who traditionally fund education work to have more integration of this in their funding. Again, a lot more work needs to be done in this, as Jenny pointed out, to bridge that gap, to have less of a projectized approach, but looking at how education systems can be strengthened to address gender violence in education across the system. And then there's always this, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just thinking we've only got 5 minutes, so do you want to just wrap up and then we'll?
Yeah, my last point is to just leave with the thought that as a global coalition, it has provided this space, but a lot more work now needs to be done at the regional and national level to have similar kind of approaches to bringing more evidence to light on this. Over.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I'm going to, we have one more slide on some of the references from this. We also have much more extended reference list. So I'll make this available, but if you want to email me, then I can send you the more detailed notice in the chat that or in the Q&A that people are asking about some of the other studies. Sorry, I'm going to stop the sharing now. So we've just got a few minutes. So do raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And And while you're thinking about that, I'll just pick up a couple of things that are in the chat. Yes, in our full reports, there we've specifically also looked at violence in the home, and there is some good evidence as well around violence in the home and some of those interventions being effective in reducing violence. There's far fewer studies that look across school and home, and yet that's quite an important area, obviously. And then the last question here is an interesting one around what prompted the need for increased studies in the African continent. I think originally they came about partly because of HIV, and also within the education sector with the EFA movement, and violence has been seen as one reason that young people are out of school. So that kind of, but particularly around HIV, some of the work around sexual violence and intimate partner violence came out almost as a sort of byproduct of work that was actually on HIV. So I think that was kind of what precipitated it in the first place. So Africa's always been quite strong around work, particularly around kind of sexual violence area compared with other parts of the world. Obviously there's lots and lots of work in the USA as well, but we were focusing particularly here on LMIC. But very interesting question you've also got in there around which institutions conducted the studies. I mean, I think increasingly, as Sujata was saying, studies are being led locally, but quite often some of the early studies particularly, and the cross-country studies are being kind of funded through large donor organizations, sometimes with people like me involved in it. So, you know, kind of global north people, but trying to work in partnerships. So working with research teams from the south as well. So there's a kind of growing emphasis on creating dialogues, but it's still absolutely a need. I mean, the hierarchies around knowledge and whether the kind of universities in the north find it easier to get things published. You know, some of the large scale studies need kind of resources or entail resources that often are held in universities in the north as well. So there's, but it is shifting, but it's an important issue to be raising. Are there, I might be missing, are there any, I can't see whether there are any hands up.
We do have one. Isak has raised his hand. I'll allow him to talk if that's okay.
Please do, yeah.
Okay, Isak, you're on.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much to the speakers for that elaborate presentation. Mine is just an observation, and more especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic started, there seemed to be some correlation between student-related gender-based violence and mental health. Okay, I think that's something that I've not seen in the type of presentations, because in my view, I think mental health also has to plays as a catalyst for some of the student-related gender-based violence. Because if you look at the backgrounds of students and also the backgrounds of the teachers, you find that there are some of them who come from this troublesome. Okay, sorry to use that word. From these backgrounds whereby not much was done, more especially during the time when they were experiencing financial constraints or even maybe social constraints. I think that's something that needs to be addressed, and I'll need your elaboration on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't focused on that in this presentation because we've been focusing particularly on research that's been done on interventions and policies and practices, whereas you're raising an issue to do with violence itself and how that's happening, which is a slightly different body of research. But it's, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there are studies, a number of studies are emerging around how the links between economic pressures on families, the school closures, often for very extended periods in many countries, how those relate to the kinds of violence that might be happening within a family and the kind of pressures and tensions in a family, and to particular forms of gender-based violence that are happening. So there is some emerging evidence around that. Lucia, did you or Sujata, would either of you like to come in on any of the questions or points that have been raised in the chat? Or
yeah, well, Jenny, I think you responded really well, but again, the last comment also brings up the idea of how studies usually are not looking into, the structural elements of violence, and they're very much focused sometimes on individual behavior change. So that's also an area that is missing. How can we add views on structural inequalities within the violence work?
Sujata, do you want to come in?
No, I think both of you covered, made good points about the more research, and I see Nike's point about also having more people who are doing work in the global South to be, to have their voices also present. I think that's an important point. And therefore, I think what I said, we do need more of these kind of conversations to happen, not at the global level, but regionally and nationally.
Yeah, and I think, the points, I've seen a change in the work that you've been doing over the years around where those discussions happen. So the points you're making, I think, around actually moving any meetings to happen in the Global South explicitly led by partners and organizations within the Global South, and the bringing in the kind of youth activists and the feminist activist voices into the discussion. There seems to me to have been a shift in that focus. So yeah, take on board those points. I'm kind of aware that we're running out of time here, I'm not sure, Gun, whether we need to stop now.
You can have a few more minutes if there are any questions that you would like to answer. That's absolutely fine.
I can see there's one more question here on affirmative action. I think it kind of depends what you mean by affirmative action, Isaac. And we've got one on impact of COVID. The last question also, we've got one on the impact of COVID specifically on online manifestations of Srgb. That's a very interesting question. I haven't seen any coming from the Global South. There's a lot of work coming in the North at the moment on online abuse, not specifically to do with COVID, but obviously a lot of anxiety about whether that increases during school closures. So there is this kind of growing area, and I think the online abuse and cyberbullying and so on is a very under-researched area still in the Global South. There are studies that are coming out about different forms of violence while schools are closed. There are, for schools themselves as well, I think there's been some questions around what happens when schools are opening, because we have some of the work that we've been doing with Ugandan colleagues and researchers in Uganda have, it's very anecdotal at the moment because schools are still closed, but when there was a small period of schools reopening, some of the young people that we were working with were talking about kind of harsh punishments happening when they were back in school, partly we think because of the pressures that the schools were under, huge pressures when they reopened. So I think that kind of the pressures on teachers and the expectations that schools are meant to be dealing with forms of abuse, and yet they have 1,000 other things to be dealing with, hasn't always been dealt with very well. So that is a bit, I haven't really got anything to substantiate that. It's just a slightly anecdotal reflection from me. Has there been extensive work done more on boys? Yeah, we've been talking, there needs to be more work on violence that boys experience. In some ways, there's loads of it. I mean, there's been all the work around gangs and so on, and a lot of work on kind of youth violence. Doesn't always mention gender, but it means boys. So there is some work there. But in terms of sexual violence, it's still a very, very silent area. We know that it happens, but it's not been well researched yet. In terms of action, there's a lot of scope for developing the gender dimensions of violence that boys experience. Sujata, Lucia, do you want to have a last word? Any of you?
I think, Jenny, just to thank everybody for, happy to have shared this space with the panelists and everybody else on the call.
Thank you. And just to address the issue of, someone's raised the issue of violence against boys versus girls, I think that comes back to the question of data in terms of gender disaggregation, and also looking at norms and stereotypes that impact both boys and girls on this issue. So there's a lot more work to be done around that. I'll just say end with that. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you, Jenny and Lucia.
Thank you. I can see there's a debate. It's lots of happening here around affirmative action. That there's a whole load of work that's emerging around backlash and whether if you work on women's empowerment and gender, whether there's going to be a kind of backlash. But we haven't really got time to go into that now. But it's work that needs to be done. There's more still to do. It's hugely political, a lot of the work. So none of this work is free of politics or contestation. But yeah, thanks for the questions. And yeah, thanks Lucia and Sujata for the work that you're doing. And thanks to LIDC as well for inviting us to share and have that discussion. Please do drop me an email at jenny.parks@ucl.ac.uk if you want some further references or some of the background documents, and I'll share with Gun the slides so that they can be available from LIDC as well if you want to have the full references. Thanks everybody.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I will send around an email to everyone who signed up for the event with the recording, and I can include the references in that email. I think that would be useful. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us today, and not least a huge virtual applause to Jenny, Sujata, and Lucia for joining us today. And hope to see you at our next LIDC event in January. Okay, so thank you again, and have a nice Christmas and New Year's period.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.